September 2023, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, an island known for quiet roads, ocean views, and some of the most expensive homes in America. No one expected a landscaping project to become one of the strangest property disputes in the area. At first, it looked like a simple renovation. Workers arrived, trees started disappearing. Not one or two, 136. The problem? They weren't his trees. What started as an attempt to improve an ocean view would eventually become a multi-million-dollar legal battle. Martha's Vineyard isn't the kind of place most people associate with legal battles. Off the coast of Massachusetts, the island has a reputation for privacy, expensive homes, and quiet communities. People come here to disappear for a while, to get away from cities, to avoid attention. Over the years, Martha's Vineyard became known as a place where politicians, celebrities, business executives, and wealthy families could escape public life. And with homes worth millions of dollars, privacy wasn't the only thing people were buying. They were buying location, space, silence, and views, especially views. Because on Martha's Vineyard, a clear view of the ocean could completely change the value of a property. A better view could mean more money, more status, more demand. Sometimes, a lot more. And in neighborhoods built around scenery and privacy, small changes could create very big problems. A fence, a tree, a blocked view. Things that sound small somewhere else could quickly become personal here. Because property disputes rarely begin with something dramatic. Most of the time, they begin with tiny decisions. A complaint, a disagreement, a line on a map. And according to later court filings, somewhere inside that quiet landscape, someone made a decision. At the time, it probably didn't seem extraordinary. But eventually, that decision would become impossible to ignore.
At first, nobody realized the scale of what had happened. Large properties on Martha's Vineyard sit behind the trees, fences, and private roads. People value privacy here. And unless you live next door, you don't always notice changes immediately. But eventually, something felt different. The landscape looked more open, more exposed. Views that had once been blocked suddenly weren't. And for people who had lived there for years, that stood out immediately. Because places like these become familiar. People know the roads, they know the trees, they know what belongs there. And eventually, questions started spreading. Workers had been seen, equipment had been there. Something had happened. But at first, people may have assumed simple explanations. Storm damage, routine clearing.
Property maintenance. Nothing unusual, until the numbers started appearing. Not one tree, not 5, not 20. According to later court filings, approximately 136 trees had been removed. Beech trees, oak trees, locust trees. Some reportedly reaching nearly 100 feet tall. And according to descriptions later included in the lawsuit, parts of the property looked less like landscaping work and more like a war zone. At that point, the questions changed. No longer, what happened? Now people wanted to know, who allowed it? By late 2019, the situation had already changed. According to later court records, approximately 136 trees had been removed from nearly half an acre of land, And what may have looked like ordinary landscaping work from a distance was starting to become something very different. Because once people understood the scale of what had happened, questions started spreading quickly. By February 2022, private conversations had turned into a lawsuit. The dispute had reached Dukes County Superior Court. And once the case entered the legal system, the story started changing. Because rumors became documents, questions became allegations, and for the first time, timelines, names, and competing versions of events started appearing in public records. At the center of the case was Martha Caudill. According to court filings, approximately 136 trees had been removed from nearly half an acre of land. Not shrubs, not small decorative trees, beech trees, oak trees, locust trees, some reportedly reaching close to 100 feet in height. And according to the complaint, parts of the property had been left looking like what lawyers later described as a war zone. That phrase stood out because people weren't describing a property dispute anymore. They were describing destruction. But almost immediately, the case became more complicated because another version of events started appearing. Sarah and Robert Nixon, owners of the Beach Plum Inn, denied the central allegations. And according to reports, part of their response sounded surprisingly simple. They already had a beautiful view. They didn't need another one. They didn't need a wider one. And they didn't need one badly enough to risk a legal disaster. Then, another name started appearing inside the case. Eric Taylor. According to reports, Taylor had allegedly crossed a fence and entered land he wasn't supposed to be on. And according to that version of events, he had acted independently, not under instructions, not as part of a larger plan, on his own. Now there were two completely different versions of the same story. One side described a deliberate effort to reshape the landscape. The other suggested the people at the center of the accusations weren't responsible at all. And somewhere inside thousands of words, allegations, and legal filings was a much simpler question. What actually happened? And as the case moved forward, another battle started taking shape. Because now, the argument wasn't only about responsibility. It was about damage. And damage, in cases like this, can become its own war. Because how do you place a value on 136 trees? Not decorative plants, not backyard shrubs. Trees that had reportedly stood there for decades, some reaching nearly 100 feet in height. Some part of a landscape people had known for years. And once experts entered the dispute, the numbers started changing dramatically. According to later reports, estimates connected to the plaintiff placed damages at roughly $3.6 million. But another estimate painted a completely different picture. Around $700,000. The difference wasn't small. It wasn't even close. Now, the gap between the two sides had become enormous. One side saw millions in destruction. The other saw numbers that were dramatically lower. And suddenly, the case wasn't only asking, who was responsible? Now another question had appeared. How much was one landscape actually worth? As the legal battle continued, both sides kept preparing for a fight that could become much larger. Because by now, this wasn't just a dispute over trees. It had become a battle over responsibility, property rights, and millions of dollars. Lawyers continued building arguments. Experts entered the discussion. Damage estimates kept pushing both sides further apart. According to later reports, One estimate placed damages at roughly $3.6 million. Another placed the number much closer to 700,000. The difference wasn't small. And if the case moved forward, a jury could eventually decide who was responsible, who made the decisions, who gave instructions, and who would pay for them. But courtroom battles are expensive, long, unpredictable, and sometimes both sides reach a point where continuing the fight becomes its own risk. By 2023, after years of filings, accusations, and legal negotiations, the case moved into mediation. Then, finally, an agreement. A settlement worth approximately $2.5 million. Roughly $1.5 million connected to the Nixon side. Another $1 million connected to insurance tied to Eric Taylor. Officially, the dispute was over. No jury, no dramatic courtroom verdict, no final confrontation. Just signatures, paperwork, and a closed case file. But long before the settlement, long before the legal arguments, and long before millions of dollars entered the story, someone made a decision. And that decision changed everything. Because in the eyes of the law, there are no accidents, only choices. This is Zero Witness Files. Subscribe for more real case files hidden inside documents, court records, and local headlines.